Welcome back to the Valley of Peak Nutrition Podcast. We're continuing our series called No Off Season this week, and we're looking at physical training. Obviously, physical training has a big component of anything that you're preparing to do in the outdoors, assuming that it's something physical. We're joined by Jake from Atomic Athlete. Jake describes what Atomic Athlete is and why that's particularly important for this episode. More importantly, we dive into really what the three main things are that are worth focusing on to improve your physical fitness between now and whenever your planned event is. They're three very simple things too, by the way. We also talk about what establishing a base actually means for endurance-based activity, how to increase that base, and how to progress. It's a lesson in practical application with physical fitness that was really good conversation. It was important to me as we developed this that we gave some practical information on how you could take your training from where it is and actually start to develop some sort of a plan that progresses you and gets you to where you want. I think Jake did an incredible job doing just that. So we will dive in, and if you have any questions, as always, you can send those to info@v2pnutrition.com. I will list the Atomic Athlete contact information in the show notes, as well as some other helpful resources from those guys. So if you do have interest in participating in one of their programs, learning more about them, or checking them out, you can do that. But without further ado, here is the conversation with Jake from Atomic Athlete on how to develop your own training plan for the off season. Jake, thanks for jumping on the podcast today. It's great to have you. We've been doing a series over since the start of the year, really, called No Off Season, with the idea of really trying to get guys to prepare now for stuff that they want to do later. Can you give just kind of your standard introduction of who you are and what Atomic Athlete is and how you got interested in training for your own personal goals?
Yeah, name's Jake Sines. Started Atomic Athlete in 2009. Always had an interest in training. Was first exposed to small town Texas high school. Was playing soccer. Got thrown into what I would call the lesser sport athletic conditioning class. It wasn't baseball, basketball, football, so all the other sports got tossed into one class called athletic conditioning. And it was a phenomenal class, and it was my first exposure to training. It was real, like actual structured training, which was kind of cool that my first experience was like that. And essentially just trained all through high school with powerlifting, track, did a little bit of soccer, went in the military afterwards, spent 4 years there, continued to train a lot. Once again, kind of was brought to my attention that lack of structure was kind of a big thing. I would always ask why. And then when I got out of the military, went and got a degree in business. And when I got done, I was looking around for jobs, and, basically one thing I had a lot of experience in was, training, and I did some more continuing education there, got my CSCS, and then started the gym and training full time in 2009. So now we got two facilities here in Austin. We train 300 athletes down here at the main location, about 150 at our north location. Then we got the online training platform where we write programs for military personnel or just general fitness or backcountry hunting, that kind of stuff.
So when you were in the military, and like I had this question when you initially said that, so I don't want to portray that the military lacks structure in their physical training, but did you notice that the lack of structure based on your knowledge of training was really the impetus for wanting to go into the business for yourself?
I think so. And even, I'll just flat out say, like, the military does not have a very good structure in physical. Even now, we still do a lot of work with, like, the special forces community. We'll go out there and teach programming seminars. And at least nowadays there's, access to, online training and programs, which a lot of individuals were get a hold of. But as far as organizational wide, like how to properly employ like fitness training and protocols it's still pretty bad. It's getting better, but the military, whatever branch you're in, is a really big organization and creating, widespread change. Like, imagine if from your perspective as a dietitian that you want to change how military chow hall works. That is a much larger undertaking than just going to one facility and, revamping the menu, So that was one of the things where I went in the military already very fit. I was a good performer, And I would watch guys who, even in a special operations unit, guys would get there, but they weren't as fit, and they'd be trying out for certain courses and whatnot. And they would struggle. And like the methodology at that point was, let's just hammer them hard as we can, and eventually they'll get better. And if they don't get better, then they'll go away. And so that kind of sparked my interest of like, hey, like why are we doing this? Like what? It seems to me like you're hurting this guy more than you're helping him. Because you're making him run 8 miles in boots and body armor on concrete, and he's struggling to pass a 2 mile, run. Like, to me, those two things just don't make sense. So
Yeah, I think that that's a great lead in to the conversation, right? Because guys that are going to train for the military, what's the standard military test? Well, it's got
so
an acronym.
it used to be the ACFT, and then they've gone through like a 2 or 3 year process. Sorry, APFT was the old one, and then now they're shifting over to the ACFT, which is a better test. I mean, it has 6 events instead of 3. It's a lot more applicable to the job, but they've gone through like 2 or 3 years now of trying to ID what the correct scoring protocol and the correct exercises, and I think they finally, settled down and picked one and have it finalized. And I think that one's kind of getting implemented across the board this year.
And I only know this because there's been guys that have reached out for the nutrition end of things who were preparing for this, and it seems like this is my perception. So you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong here, because you got way more exposure to these folks than I do. It seems like, generally speaking, guys that are preparing for this, the game plan is two things. Either one, I'm just going to beat myself to death in the name of getting fitter, and then when I go to take this test, like, I'll pass it. Or two, I know what the standards are. I'm going to aim to achieve the standard, nothing over it. Like, I just want to pass it. And so they train what they think will accomplish the standard, but then generally fall short or just get in by the nick of, just by a little bit to meet the standard. Is that your kind of experience in terms of seeing how guys prepare, whether it's for this or for anything physical?
Yeah, I guess we see a lot of guys on the either special forces side or like combat controller, PJ. So usually the guys that get a hold of us are a little more vested in their performance, and they're going to try out for a specific position versus just be a basic infantry guy in the Army or something like that. There's still standards there, but those are pretty easy. As long as you exercise, you're typically going to be able to pass a standard. But when it comes to the selection process, that's when a lot of guys are. There's a lot of like kind of myth out there about what they're going to experience, how well they have to do, and so what you mentioned earlier, the whole more is better kind of thing, that happens a lot. They'll just do an excessive amount of volume. They think, well, if 1 mile is good, then 3 must be better, and if 3 is good, then 8 must be better. And if they basically just do too much, and they have these kind of like expectations in their mind of like, hey, I have to be able to do this, and I'm like, hey man, you only have 6 months. Like, that's not a reasonable goal. Like, that's you're shooting way, like, you're talking, this is like a 2-year goal to be able to hit those metrics, depending on how fit the person is. So and then, yeah, obviously, if you're trying out for something, then you don't want to just meet the standard. You definitely want to exceed it, because you're competing for a slot.
Yeah, there's like I think that that's a great perspective, because oftentimes, even in like the nutrition world, the expectation that people have, it's they'll paint this image of themselves as having fallen short of that. Like, they'll set a metric or a goal for themselves, they fall short of it, and somehow that means that they're a failure. And it's usually a conversation of that expectation was just unrealistic. That you were trying to achieve something in such a small gap. You had not only no margin for error, but it was so unrealistic that you were trying to squeeze something in 3 months that really takes 9. So you didn't fail. It was just the expectation was unrealistic. Fitness, and correct me if I'm wrong here too, but fitness seems to be a lot like nutrition, where people will sometimes, and this isn't the standard for everyone, but for a lot of folks, 90% of their time focusing in on things that don't make any difference at all, 10% of their time focusing on stuff that actually matters. What are the 10% of fitness? Like, what would be the 3 to 4, however many you would think, kind of top low-hanging fruit? If you can only manage to focus on 3 things, this is going to be what's the best ROI for you.
Yeah, a general statement, we'll say fitness encompasses both the strength side and the conditioning side. First of all, for fitness, I would say Because you can be strong and you can be fast, but you sometimes may not be the other one, right? There's plenty of strong guys who do powerlifting meets who have zero conditioning whatsoever. And on the other side, those guys who can run endurance events like the Ironman or the marathon, but struggle back squatting their body weight. So fitness is a combination of the two. And the three things I would say is make it a habit. All right. Like I used to love to train. Sometimes I still like to train, but now I just train because it's like brushing my teeth. It's just like, it's something I have to do on a regular basis. Not only professionally, but also just for health, right? And I mean, I've been doing it since I was 14 now, and I'm 42. So pretty much any workout you can think of, I've done something along those lines. But to me, I just look at it like a hat, like brushing my teeth. And I think people have to look at it. It's not, you're not going to the bar with your buddy is going to have a blast, right? It's like, hey, this is just something I need to do. So make it a habit, number one. Number two, do it at least 3 times a week. 3 is kind of like, I would say, the minimal level. 4 is good, and 5 is probably on the high side, depending on what kind of sport you're doing or what your goals are. You may push into the 6 or 7 day a week range. That's a more in-depth conversation. And then the third thing I kind of alluded to in the first one is that if you want to be fit, it has 2 parts. It has the conditioning side, and however you want to call it, cardio, endurance. There's a bunch of different ways you can kind of frame that. And then the strength side. And that's kind of how we frame all our programming. It's the metabolic side and the muscular side. So those 3 things I think would be, just do that. Make it a habit. Do it 3 to 5 times a week. Make sure you're doing some conditioning, some strength work.
So like you would categorize conditioning as being cardio focused, and the strength side obviously being as kind of a resistance trained or strength training focus. And a combination of those 2 would essentially make a person quote unquote fitter.
Yeah. I mean, so definition of fitness is going to be very dependent based on if you're a military person, if you're a soccer player, it's different than being a track athlete. It's different than being a triathlete, right? So the idea of who's the most fit is kind of a silly concept. But generally speaking, you need to have a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, that was a question I was going to ask is, like, what does that even mean? I want to become fitter, right? In terms of, is that even a good question to ask? And I guess maybe a better question, if someone was to create a goal and say, look, I want to be fitter, really what they're trying to say is I want to be better at accomplishing something. Is there something that, like, as a coach, you would suggest they do to create a better goal than something as general as to say, I just want to be fitter?
Yeah, at least in the sports side of things, performance side, you can say like, well, what is fit enough? And it's like, well, I'm fit enough to actually compete or play at the desired level, right? So if you find like you want to go, let's just say soccer, you're out playing soccer and everyone around you is outrunning you and outworking you, and you're being held back, your skills cannot be expressed due to the fact you cannot keep up with the pace, then your fitness is lacking. If you're the guy who goes out the soccer field, then you're able to move and work the entire time. You still might not be the best person because your skills might be lacking, but you're able to at least move and work and compete at the desired level. Then I would say your fitness is high enough. Same thing with hunting. If you're going to do, you obviously work with a lot of hunters, but if you're going to do like, spot and stalk glassing mule deer, and so you spend most of your time just sitting and glassing, then your fitness won't be as high as if you're doing archery elk, hunting in the back country, and you don't know where elk are. So now you're covering 10 to 15, maybe plus miles a day with a 20 to 25 pound pack. Trying to find a bugling elk is a very different physical endeavor than sitting up on a ridge line glassing for mule deer.
So if, let's say that, like, one of the term that comes to my mind, and this may or may not be true, but one thing that we throw around a lot is, if you've got really specific goals, there has to be specificity in the training, right? Like, you can't just go in and bench and expect to be a great archery elk hunter doing tons of vertical, elevation climbing and descending and doing a bunch of miles. It's not going to do anything for you. So specificity matters. What are the principles, or maybe a better question would be, how do principles change based on the goal between, let's say, strength, endurance, or if maybe somebody's listening, they're like, look, I don't care about any of those. I just want to look good with my shirt off. So aesthetics.
Yeah.
What are the training principles that are different among those 3 based on what the desired end outcome is?
Well, I guess performance wise, which I always say performance is very different than aesthetics. Typically when people say they want to get in shape, it means they want to look in shape, And that's really what most people mean, right? Now, if you like, we hear this a lot. Guys go backcountry hunting, or I'll take guys for the first time in the backcountry, and afterwards they say, "I need to get in shape." Like they're saying, "I need to be able to walk up the mountain and keep up with Jake or whoever else is up there hunting." That's a very different thing than what most people mean. Like when you hear Christmas, for example, your sister or your in-laws like, "Oh, I got to get in shape." They're just talking about leaning out and having a better body composition. But performance-wise, it comes down to an allocation of training time, is what I would say. So one of the ways that we kind of break up our programs is basically like, hey, how much time? And for example, in the gym, we program 5 days a week. What percentage of that 5 hour block is typically what we do, is going to be dedicated towards the muscular side or the metabolic side, right? So if you're a backcountry hunter, most of your time should be spent more on the metabolic side. You're conditioning, developing aerobic capacity, developing strength endurance in the lower body. So essentially all you're doing is you're going to basically choose where to dedicate that time to, because you can only train for so long in a week, right? Unless you're going to be a high level endurance athlete, then you might be pushing, 10, 15, maybe even 20 hours a week if you're doing a triathlon type training. But most people, realistically, you're going to have probably 3 to 6 hours to train a week. So the question is, where are you going to spend that time, and where are you going to get the most bang for your buck?
So I guess first question for someone who's not familiar with the terminology metabolic conditioning, how would you define that?
So the easy way to say it, the layman's term would be cardio, right? Just better cardio. So that's we call it energy system development. That's why we use the term metabolic. But basically, it's improving a bunch of different facets. And typically, we break it up into 2 categories. It's going to be the aerobic and anaerobic side. All right. So if anyone's ever heard of CrossFit or HIIT training, that's all anaerobic. Aerobic is that long, slow distance that pretty much any endurance athlete who's ever done a program or trained or competed is very, very familiar with. So metabolic is our conditioning side, and then the muscular side would be what we call the strength side of things. The ability to pick up heavy objects, the ability to stabilize heavy objects, the ability to stabilize your pack on your back under heavy load for extended duration.
It's great. So if like let's just look at the endurance side of things for a minute, because oftentimes, like, at least the people that are interested in this podcast are either focused on some sort of endurance something. Oftentimes, like, endurance is thought of like ultra marathon or backcountry ski touring, and those are inclusive of people that listen to this, but it's also hunting in the West over broad seasons. It's people doing through hikes. It's all sorts of stuff. So a lot of people, though I 100% agree with you, when they first start this out, they want to look in shape and they'll devote a lot of time to the strength training side of things, never realizing like that's not going to do anything for your endurance. So if we strictly look at the endurance side of things, what in my reading, and feel free to correct me because you're the expert in this for sure, the main, like, low hanging fruit for endurance based training is building a base and then extending out from there. So I guess I've got a couple of questions with that. One, how long does it take to build a base? And how would someone who's maybe not really experienced in training start building a base?
Well, so a lot of times you hear all the benefits of the high intensity stuff, right? And the high intensity stuff is great as like a jump starter. You're going to see really dramatic changes really quickly, but what's going to happen is you're going to plateau, usually within 2 or 3 months, right? So you start doing all the HIIT training, you start doing hill sprints, you start doing the Metcons and CrossFit is a big fan of. Then what happens is you'll build some fitness pretty quickly, but what happens is the infrastructure is kind of not been established, right? It's like now you're trying to drive a whole bunch of vehicles through, very thin roads that, only have one lane and they're just kind of jammed up. So aerobic capacity, volume is king. And that's kind of like, that's what we call it, the base. The wider the base, the higher the mountain can be if you wanted to use fitness as a mountain. So it's actually really simple. The downside is it's really boring. It's typically done in zone 2. It's typically done with a single modality. It can be hiking uphill. It can be dragging a tire. It can be riding a bike. It can be running. If you're a hunter, the best thing to do is just to go out and hike. I live in Texas, so I don't have access to all mountains or anything. So we drag tires and ride bikes a lot out here. Step ups is a common one. We've used that and the Exo Mountain Gear training program. The Ultimate Predator uses that as well. But I've kind of fell out of love with the step ups because they just aren't hard enough, right? There's, as opposed to going uphill consistently for 500 to 1,000 vertical feet, when you do step ups, you step up and step down. And so you don't quite get that same burn that you get with a heavy gear bike or a tire drag. Volume is king. Do as much as you can. Only progress as fast as you're able to. You gotta be smart. So we had that conversation earlier about people doing too much too fast. Kind of like, I'm sure you experienced it on the nutrition side. They go from X number of calories, like, cool, I'm going to go from, let's just say 2,800 calories. I'm going to drop down to 1,200. And it's like, whoa, dude, like that's a pretty extreme jump, Single modes done in zone 2 for an extended duration. I'd say for most people, the reasonable window is probably going to be, when we did it in a gym, we did a big kind of experiment. 3 to 5 hours of aerobic work per week is a pretty good range for the average person who's not, an endurance athlete.
So I got so many questions. I think it's awesome. So I guess the first question, going back to the step up thing, and I mentioned this because it was a topic on Rock Slide at one point. I had chimed in, but I think it's a larger thinking, which is this. Okay, well, if a 12-inch box gets me some fitness, a 32-inch has got to be just like great, right?
Yeah.
Just going to destroy me, and that's going to mean even better performance in the backcountry. Does the height of the step up, regardless of the intensity, like you'd mentioned, I'm kind of bored with them because they're relatively easy, and I would agree with you.
Yeah.
Does having an 18-inch box versus a 20-inch box versus a 12-inch box make a difference? And you made a comment in that...
I think I saw this thread. Yeah.
You made a comment in the thread that I was like, man, this is why he's the man. Do you remember what it was?
I don't remember it, but I remember reading it and being annoyed by one guy's response.
You said, because you're never going to be jumping over 32 inches of anything in the backcountry. And I didn't tell you this, but I actually just recently listened to a podcast that you did with Pineland Underground, which was excellent. It's almost 2 hours, but it's excellent. You and the other guy on there did a really good job talking about the training. But one of the recurring themes that you always seem to have, that I perceive that you have anyway, and one of the reasons I just love the programming you guys do, is everything is related to real world applications. Like, if you're not going to do this in the real world, why are you wasting your time trying to perfect something that's like maybe going to be in a video game, but never in life? And I just think the carryover on those things is like, many people are, I guess it goes back to the 90-10 thing. I just see a lot of people wasting so much time doing stuff that doesn't matter, like that influencers are doing or whatever. And it's like, that is not going to do anything. And this, like the specificity thing in my own learning of nutrition and fitness, the specificity was such an eye opener when I started to learn. It's like, man, if you want to be motivated to go work out, train for something. Stop trying to go burn calories, right? To get the cupcake, get on the elliptical and just do 45 minutes of arduous rotations on that. So you burn 300 calories to get your cut like that. Nobody's going to be motivated by that.
Yeah. The step up thing. I mean, essentially what happens is, you go any higher than 12, and we've done them at all heights. I mean, I've done, 20-inch, 24-inch, right? Essentially, it's going to turn into a strength exercise at some point if it's loaded. So now doing step-ups with like a 30-pound pack for like muscular endurance might be wise, but you're not going to really be able to do that at a good tempo for 30 minutes. And then what's going to happen is eventually, as you become fatigued, you're going to be stepping down, and you're going to kind of end up falling down versus stepping down under control. And then what happens is you start accumulating more damage, for lack of a better term, on your knees, ankles, hips, whatever it may be. And that's probably one of the most common conversations I have is a lot of guys who hunt are older, like, yes, you have like the 25-year-old guys who are just getting into it, but a lot of these guys have been doing this, 20 years, they're in their 40s. And so what we need to do is build appropriate fitness that they can actually, and using modality they can actually do. And I'll challenge anyone out there who's into the whole step up thing. Like I said, I've done thousands and thousands and probably tens of thousands of step ups because I'm a flatlander. But basically, the feeling I get when I climb is not the same feeling I get when doing step-ups. It's totally different. There's a concentric phase and an eccentric phase. You're stepping up, you're stepping down. My legs do not burn, even if I loaded myself with a 50-pound kettlebell. If I go at a fast enough pace, then I can kind of get my heart rate up. But the thing is, it's like, I'm not stepping like it doesn't seem similar. Yes, you're stepping uphill, but you're stepping down. Riding a bike on a really heavy gear is much more similar to what you're going to experience climbing. Because when you're going uphill, there is no like downward phase. It's up, and your legs don't get that kind of like little break every time. So yeah, over time I've kind of fallen out of love with it, but 12 inch just seems to work, and I would kind of put that in the number 3 or number 4 category of like hunting exercises now.
Yeah, and the other thing that you'd briefly touched on whenever you were going through those things is the tire drag. Oh God, those
Yeah.
things are just absolutely torturous. And I'll put a link actually in the show notes to you guys did a kind of a tutorial that's in your online, resources on how to build your own tire
Yeah.
drag. And like the hardest part for me was finding a used tire. And then as I started looking, it was like they were everywhere. And man, those
Yes.
things are
Yeah. Yeah.
they're just brutal. So going back to a couple of other things that you had mentioned, you said you want to train in zone 2. Can you kind of outline what does that mean? What's the value of being in zone 2 versus maybe let's say another zone? And what are you trying to accomplish by staying in that as opposed to above it?
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, you mentioned earlier specificity. Your body recognizes two things: volume and intensity. Intensity is going to determine what type of adaptations are created. Okay. So the harder you go, there's different adaptations. The easier you go, and what we're looking for with aerobic capacity is a couple things. Capillary density is one of the biggest ones. All right. So capillary density is basically you're developing an infrastructure that allows more of the muscle tissue to be oxygenated. And so that is a byproduct of training at low intensity. Zone 2 is typically what's going to be used in most endurance. Bunch of ways to find out what zone 2 is. 55 to 75% of max heart rate is kind of like the generic rule. There's a maffetone method. I've done blood lactate tests, gas exchange tests. There's like 10 different ways you can establish like what is your zone 2. But for the person who's not going to go out and do all the nerdy stuff, it's like you should be able to run, breathe through your nose, and have a conversation. All right. And that's typically going to be like the aerobic zone. It's not hard. It's not like, Instagram worthy. It's pretty easy work. And the hardest part is just doing it. And so we have to kind of trick our athletes in the gym, and we kind of make it like fun by doing a certain exercise, then riding the bike for 2 minutes, then doing a different exercise and run for 2 minutes. And it's kind of like we use the analogy, the cauliflower and the mashed potatoes. Like when you're trying to get your kids to eat vegetables, right? You can't just be like, hey, eat the cauliflower. And they're like, no, I don't want to eat it. It's gross. It's like, okay, I'm just going to put it in the mashed potatoes. And then now you don't know you're doing it. And that's kind of what we have to do with the athletes here in the gym. Along with that capillary density, mitochondrial density, basically like the energy systems, the power plants of creating energy through the aerobic energy system, is going to be the two most desirable things. You're basically teaching your body to use oxygen in the aerobic energy system. You're teaching it to draw from a fat source versus a carbohydrate source. All right. So you're going to pull from, typically there's 3 different energy systems. Creatine phosphate's kind of like more, that's field sports, it's soccer, baseball, throwing, track and field. The glycolytic and the aerobic energy system are the 2 that are pretty much going to rely on most of the time. And you're always going to be pulling from both of them at the same time. But the goal is to teach your body to pull from the aerobic energy system because it's pretty much inexhaustible. All right. Like if you go hard for an hour, hour and a half, you've seen it in any endurance sport, you're going to bonk, you're going to crash. You run out of glycogen, you start to get kind of fuzzy headed, maybe get a little bit of nauseous. On the aerobic side, I mean, you can go for days and days, assuming the intensity is at the right level. And hunting is a multi-day. I've only had to sprint hunting a couple times, to cut off a bull or, something like that. Usually it's just that long, slow grind day after day. So that's why the aerobic energy system is just so important. It's just really boring.
One of the things that you had mentioned about like the endurance aspect, and I thought was so good, is unless you're competing in something where there is a place system, right? Like there's an award for coming in a certain position or it's a timed event. The goal of endurance is just to finish, right? You're not
Yeah.
necessarily worried about how fast you're coming in. The ultimate goal is that you want to finish. So you're right. One of the ways I've heard it phrased, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, but if you're not monitoring heart rate and you're not doing some of those Because nutrition's a lot of the same, right? Like we've got some really good algorithms that'll estimate caloric needs,
Mhm.
but the gold standard's hooking somebody up to a gas exchange system. Not many people are going to do
Yeah.
that, so we lean on these algorithms and these estimates. One of the ways I've heard it put in to one of the ways I've, from a general standpoint, because we're always talking about optimal versus practical, from a practical standpoint, and not going to get a gas exchange test for myself, is you're kind of wanting the work to be the limiting factor versus your cardiovascular system. In other words, if you don't feel like you can keep going because you're out of breath, you're way too high. You're going way too fast.
Yes. Yeah. And honestly, most people, when they do this, they're going to go out there and they start actually tracking it. Like we had a bunch of SF guys come in and we gave them this whole, hour and a half long spiel on developing the aerobic system, the base. And then we strapped up on heart rate monitors and we made them go out there and stay what would theoretically be a zone 2. And a lot of them had to walk. And that doesn't mean they were out of shape. It just means that that energy system is not developed. And a great book for anyone out there who wants to dive into the endurance stuff, especially on the mountain side of things, is the Uphill Athlete book. Training. What is it?
The new guide for alpinism.
The new alpinism. Yeah, the new alpinism, and he has a running version as well. So Scott Johnson and Steve House. I went to one of their early seminars. They just explain it really, really well.
Yeah.
And like the pictures are good. I mean, like I've learned about this so many times and forgotten about all this stuff because it's never really explained in a very clear and concise way, and it's really nerdy. But they did a really good job with explaining, like, hey, like this is how this works, right? This is how you can climb, 5 mountains in the time it takes for one person to climb one mountain, right?
They do. I've actually recommended that book on here before. At least to this point, am not aware of any other like publicly available non-classroom literature that's better outlines this piece of things. I think it's a great book. And you touched on something even on the fuel side of things, like the body's always going to be utilizing a dynamic mix of fuels, right? Whether it's carbohydrates, fats, etc. But one key thing you said is that if the body continues at that intensity, you've got long fuel sources developing that system. But then as the intensity increases, relies more on carbohydrate, et cetera, et cetera. But it was an excellent overview. So general takeaway is in my experience, my observation may be the same for you. The place that folks err the most in this is we think, the harder I work, the more fit I'm going to be. That's going to get me to where I want to be. And what you're saying is, not true. You want to be doing the long, slow, arduous, non-glamorous kind of moderate intensity stuff that usually requires more time than it does effort.
Yeah. And so you asked earlier, like how long? And so if you read any endurance book, endurance athletes, they look at like their yearly volume. It's not like what's happening this season. It's like, hey, how many miles did I get in this year versus next year versus the year after, or how many hours of training? It is something that is, it's not like this month, next month. It's like, hey, like in 2 or 3 years, like I want to be able to have this many hours cumulative training volume leading up to my season or just throughout the year. And so a real endurance athlete is looking at this years at a time. And so we have to we can't think about this like 4 weeks later, 8 weeks later, 12 weeks later. Like I'd say a minimal window for base, minimal is 12 weeks, looking more like towards the 20 weeks if you really want to develop it. Like now, I mean, I didn't do any of this aerobic stuff when I was in the military, and I was still pretty fit, right? So you can still build a pretty high level of fitness and go through selection and do time rucks without doing the aerobic work. But the right way to do it and to get the most out of it will be to follow that process, right? Like you want to establish a good foundation, right? Because a good foundation is going to allow you to build a big house on it. It's not going to be one of those things where there's shortcuts. I mean, the world's best athletes, they build a base for a reason, right? So even if you're, an 800 meter, which I would say is a fairly short distance running athlete, they're still doing lots of base work, right? They're not out there just doing 400s and 800s every single time they train. They're going to be out there training probably 5 days a week, and they're doing lots of base work, lots of lower intensity work, developing that energy system. The difference of those athletes is that they're going to go into a transition and then a peaking phase. So that way they can actually run faster, right? Um, for most of us who are hunting, we don't really need to peak our hunting ability because we just got to be able to be out there for a week or 14 days or 30 days and grind every single day.
So in establishing that base over 12 to 20 weeks, what changes, right? So earlier you'd mentioned single modality. Is someone in that 12 to 20 weeks choosing one exercise and doing it, let's call it 3 times a week over that span of 12 to 20 weeks? And if they're not changing the modality, how are they improving it? What metric are they watching to continually challenge themselves in a way that grows their fitness or improves their endurance?
Well, the good thing is your body really doesn't know what modality it's doing. Um, so you have this saying that exercise is just a means to an end. So you can mix the modalities. It is going to be localized though. So for example, if you are running and cycling and hiking, you're not going to develop, more mitochondrial density and capillary density through shoulders like a boxer would. A boxer who's consistently shadow boxing using those muscles at low intensity, he's going to be able to move his upper body because he's developed that infrastructure, for lack of a better word, up there. So long as you're training the same body part, you can mix and match the modalities. So you could say, cross country skiing, running, cycling, step ups, hiking could all fall in that lower body category. The more you use one, then the more you're gonna be able to manage or track your progress. So for example, the goal would be, let's say, okay, Jake, hey, I want you to go out and run at, let's just say 55% of max heart rate. And let's just say that's gonna be 140, just for easy math. So I'm gonna go out there, run at 140, and I'm just running at 140, monitoring that. And I'm gonna manage or monitor my pace. Let's just say I start off and it's 11-minute mile as I'm running. Okay. As I go through 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, I should see like a 10:45 mile, and then a 10:30 mile, and then a 10:15, and then a 10-minute mile. So a good metric to see like, hey, I'm actually getting better is to a constant heart rate or constant output, for example. And then what is my pace or speed? And the goal would be to have the same output, that 140 beats per minute, and be able to cover more ground faster. You're just becoming more efficient. And that's going to happen not only from the physiological side, but also just the mechanical and mental side, right? You're becoming a more efficient runner. You're going to be more comfortable with that kind of feeling. We had lots of athletes when we went through we called it the Space Monkey program. We had a whole bunch of athletes do this protocol. It was all base building. And initially they were like, 30-minute run. I mean, that's awful. And then it got to the point where they were running an hour 15, and they're like, I don't understand why an hour 15 feels easier now than 30 minutes when I started. Right? They just get in that zone and kind of grind it out.
What changes after 20 weeks? Like how do you, so you establish the base, and then is after that, like let's call it 20 weeks, is that when it gets a little more advanced level training and someone would be better off to work with somebody one-on-one to develop a plan? Or is there a general rule of thumb that someone could say, look, base is established, I'm ready to take on more advanced training, higher volume? What would you say, okay, here, this and this is what you need to focus on and go do?
So it depends on the sport. For example, like hunting, you might not need to transition. If you're going to go compete at something and actually race, and let's say, for example, a 10K, right? Anyone who starts a 10K run program probably can do a 10K right then, right? So that's going to be a totally different, build up than someone who's going to try to do a marathon. Right. So your first marathon is typically going to be like, I just want to complete it. All right. Or your first Ironman or half Ironman or even an Olympic distance triathlon. So if you're actually trying to get faster, then what's going to happen is you're going to start basically adding in intensity. It may start off with like a bridge or a transition program where you're just adding 1 or 2 sessions per weekend. And then eventually you're going to go and do a peaking process. And it's not going to be so much the volume you're going to manipulate. It's going to be the intensity. So you're going to start seeing tempo runs, intervals, speed work. If you're on a bike, you're going to be riding at a certain number of watts. If you're on a rower or whatever, you may change the resistance. So you're going to start introducing more intensity. And so the normal build goes volume, low intensity, transition, and then you're going to maintain the aerobic work. So basically, you can't do a hard, high intensity session Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. There's just no time to recover. But maybe you get to a point where, hey, I'm doing 3 hard sessions a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You're still doing aerobic work on Tuesday, Thursday, maybe even Saturday and Sunday, right? That low intensity, getting the blood flowing, trying to recover. But essentially, you're going to be adding an intensity, and then you're going to start adding progressions of that intensity. So maybe it's the number of intervals you're doing. Maybe it's the duration of a tempo run. It's very old school endurance protocols, which, I mean, like, it's so funny how fitness is, always, you're always hearing new companies come out and always new things are coming up. But I mean, all the science has been around since the 80s and 90s. It's like, I mean, some of the best books written, written by the Russian coaches in 1987 or something like that.
It's the same with nutrition. It's like nothing's changed. It's like
Yeah.
people, like, what works, people have been saying for decades and decades and decades, but someone is like, then influencers came in and changed it. Would it be safe to say, like, one of the ways to get fitter, whether that is to increase your endurance, increase your strength, or whatever, is you are looking to increase volume and overload what you had previously been doing, whatever the metric is, right? Like whether it's whether you're manipulating the variable of intensity, total volume, pace, anything like that. Is it safe to say increased volume over time is what improves your fitness?
It can, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So, and from the strength perspective, it'd be increased intensity. Let's just say you start out doing 5x5s, or maybe even 5x8s, and you go to 5x5s. Then you start working down to triples, then doubles and singles. So now, like, if you're a power lifter and by the time you're in a peaking phase, you may be doing just singles and doubles. You may only bench press 10 to 15 times the whole session, when in the earlier phases, you're doing a much higher volume at a lower intensity. Maybe you're doing like a 5x10. So you're doing 50 bench presses, right? In the endurance side, endurance specifically, it is volume. You will basically look to, let's just use that example of 20 weeks, right? And you're like, okay, hey, I'm going to start off at maybe 2.5 hours per week, right? I'm going to do an hour session, a 30-minute session, and whatever modes you choose. By the end of 20 weeks, that should be in the 5, 6, or 7 hour range then, right? So progression is essentially the most powerful tool any program can have is progression. It's basically, I mean, it applies to every aspect of fitness, regardless of what you do. The key thing with progression, though, is that things have to be repeated, right? So if you look at, like, I'm not poo-pooing on CrossFit. CrossFit's a great sport, all right, or a great method of activity, but essentially there's no like repeated exercise. There's no structure. It's all random. And the downside is that you don't know how hard you're supposed to go because you haven't done it in 2 or 3 months, right? But if you're following an Olympic weightlifting program and you're snatching every Tuesday and Thursday and you're following progression, it's like, exactly where you're supposed to be on that session because it's slowly getting harder and harder and harder. Same thing with a bike interval, same thing with a ruck interval. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Volume and intensity are the things you're going to manipulate, and then progression is going to be applied to those. And that is hands down. There's no one who has any background in any type of strength and conditioning can argue with that. Progression is king. It doesn't matter if you're a bodybuilder, a power lifter, a triathlete. It doesn't matter who you are.
That's why I love the simplicity of 5x5. 5 compound lifts done over and over again. You're keeping a notebook. You know what you did the week prior.
Yeah.
You add 2.5, or you add 5 pounds to the lift, and then you repeat. Like, it's not glamorous, but man, is it effective, and it's simple for the average person, to follow. We've got a couple of minutes, and there's one more thing that I want to get your opinion on, so I'll jump into it. You said once to me, you said that excess volume is often the biggest mistake that people make. More is not better. It's like kicking a dead horse. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, and maybe even if it's applicable here, the law of diminishing returns by adding extra volume?
Yeah, and we learned about that in business school, that concept, right? It's like an additional unit of input does not always result in an additional unit of output. So there's a certain amount of work that you have to do. You have to stress your body so that it realizes, oh wow, that's a lot. It's fatigued, and then it's going to adapt, right? It's going to build some fitness so that way it can handle that volume the next time it encounters it. At a certain point, you've got there, right? Let's just use an example of bench press, since that was what we talked about a second ago. If you say I'm going to do a 5x8 of bench press, it's like, okay, cool. Like that's probably enough stimulus, assuming the barbell is loaded enough, to basically tell your body, hey, we need to adapt. We need to get stronger. So next time we do this, we can handle it, right? Doing 2 sets of 8 is not enough. Your body's just like, okay, cool, whatever. Like that was no problem. But if we do 5 or maybe even 6, it's going to be like, okay, hey, like that was good. Basically, the impetus for change has happened. If you start going into like 10 rounds of 8, it's like, well, why are we doing 10 rounds, right? If 5 or 6 was enough to create that change, then doing anything additional is just going to delay your ability to recover, right? You're going to increase your fatigue. You're going to be even more tired when you get done, which a lot of people will associate with like, oh, well, that's good. Like me being sore, me being broken or destroyed is a good thing. But the downside is it's going to delay recovery. And then the longer the recovery window is, the longer until you can train again. So now what happens is those excessive volume sessions are going to spread the frequency of training out, which lowers total weekly volume. And then you just don't get that dose as often. You know, analogy we use for making sure that you recover before the next training session is like when you paint a wall, you let the paint dry before you add the next coat, right? You don't just keep adding wet paint on top of wet paint. And that's kind of the idea with training. It's like, hey, like trained, you're going to become fatigued. You're going to be tired. You're not going to be able to perform as well. There's going to be that dip in your fitness, and it's going to adapt and then ideally super compensate and build higher fitness. And then you're able to, you know, go into the next one. So the goal would be like this kind of stair step result in fitness over time from like challenging your body and then going up. So you use 5x5 as an example. An easy way to progress that is add 2.5 pounds on each side, 5-pound total jump, right? That's starting strength protocol. Mark Ripeto's big thing is like, hey, it's like if you can do 5x5 and it's unbroken, add plates, then do it again, add plates, then do it again, add plates. And it just works. I mean, and there's no reason to go like full ham and break yourself every single time, because all you're doing is you're just delaying recovery, and it's going to take longer until you can hit it again.
I think one of the best lessons I ever learned in my own fitness or whatever was when I learned to stop chasing the pump and to follow a progression. You know, that and using, you know, just following the progression and trusting the process and loving the process versus this immediate, you know, gratification of a pump and somehow equating that to, oh boy, I'm getting stronger. When I unlearned a lot of that, not only did I start seeing my fitness actually improve, but it was funner. It was way funner, right?
Yeah.
And you know, and people will say stuff like, you know, they'll equate the effectiveness of the workout to how sore they are. It's like, well, no, because now you've got to take 4 days off. That's like you were saying, that's less volume over time. And when volume and progression is king, you're missing so many workouts because you're destroying yourself and really not. You're not. The destruction isn't even providing any value to the overall fitness. So.
It's just hurting. It's just hurting yourself. You're hurting your joints, and it really doesn't make sense, right? Like we use the horse, right? It's like the horse is dead. Why are you still shooting it? You know, it's like it's not going to become more dead. You know, and so it's, and we see it a lot. Even our open gym athletes, have a couple of athletes, I should say, that compete like on the CrossFit kind of stuff, and so they don't do our programming. And we'll watch them. We're just like, dude, what are you doing, man? You've been here 90 minutes. You're on like your 5th Metcon. Like, I mean, are you actually following a program, or are you just doing random hard shit? And a lot of times they're just doing random hard stuff. And like I said, I mean, if you love to train and you have good genetics, that's one thing we haven't talked about yet is genetics. But if you love to train and you train a lot, you will be pretty darn fit, right? Like, I mean, I did that when I was younger. I didn't follow programs. I mean, shy of a powerlifting program when I was in high school. But you'll get to a point where, oh, hey, like I'm pretty fit, I'm a top performer, but there's no way that unstructured training is going to beat structured training. Like, it doesn't matter. You take that same person, like, hey, you do your random hard stuff and let me write you a program with these goals. And I guarantee, right, anyone who knows how to program will put out a product that will have a better result than just doing random hard stuff.
Yep. I couldn't agree with that more, even just on my own personal experience. I think you've got to run, don't you?
I got a few more minutes, actually. I thought I was going to coach it for, but Jordan came in and he's coaching it for. So I'm not in a rush.
All right. Well, since you brought it up, without destroying everyone's hope on the topic of genetics, one thing that in conversations that come up with us, and people will ask me general questions like, you know, if I do an X, Y, and Z, do you think that will help me improve fitness? If I ruck 3 days a week, will that help me prepared for the backcountry or whatever? And often, like, what I always retort back to is, if you do X, Y, and Z, it seems likely that you'll get fitter, but only to your genetic potential, right? Like you're only going to be able to be like, so take me for example. I'm 5'6". I'd run to love a sub 4 minute mile. Never going to ever happen, no matter what training I try to push myself through. What role does genetics play? How can we have a realistic expectation of what our training does? And maybe as a as a piece to loop into that would be, in an effort to not completely spin our wheels, at what point do we say, okay, I've maximized this block of training. It's time for me to transition my focus into something different. Because, like, we'll stick with the example of 5x5. You can't keep adding 5 pounds forever, right? Eventually, you're going to have to transition into something different because you can. Eventually, you're going to maximize. I'd love to bench 305. It'll never happen. I weigh 145 pounds, right? So, what role does genetics have? What should our expectation to be? What should our expectations be to be realistic? And at what point do we know, look, I've maximized this block, I need to change the focus for a bit?
So genetics is going to tie into two things. One, how you look. That's huge. I mean, you can't control your genetics, right? I don't know. At some point, humans thought we were different from animals, right? We spend all this time trying to find the best cow, the best chicken. We try to hunt these units with the best elk. And at some point, we thought that, like, oh, well, the same rules that apply to every other mammal don't apply to us. And the bottom line is we can't choose who our parents are. So some people are going to naturally be jacked. Some people are naturally going to be good at endurance athletes. Some are going to be natural strength athletes, right? Like in 2022, unless you're a kicker or quarterback, you're probably not going to make it to the NFL on hard work. You're going to have like a certain type of, physique and body type. When our programs in here, some athletes, when we do work capacity or aerobic protocols, we see great results. And then on the other side of things, certain athletes will do really, really well with strength work, right? You're going to have the same athlete, same age, their nutrition is going to be different, but performance-wise, it shouldn't influence it too much. But you're going to see some athletes put on like 40 or 50 pounds on a lift, and some are only going to put on like 10 or 15. A couple of things that we'll consider or influence that is how experienced is the athlete. If you're a new athlete, you're going to see really big jumps in performance right off the bat. If you're a really experienced athlete, you're not going to see that. So I think, and the downside is, right, we have unrealistic expectations due to social media and the amount of information we have. So we see people on the internet that are like superhumans, essentially, right? If you go to the Olympics, right, the Olympics is full of superhumans. Like there's people do things in the Olympics that most of us could never hope to accomplish, right? So I think what we have to do is measure our own progress against ourselves, right? So go out there, do that assessment and see where you're at. And don't worry about your hunting buddy or the other military guy or whoever else is in the circle. Like, hey, I'm going to follow this protocol. I'm going to reassess, and I'm measuring my own independent progress from this point to this point, right? And some athletes are going to adapt very quickly. Some athletes are not. I listened to a podcast the other day about performance-enhancing drugs, and even some guys, they don't respond to that. Some guys will be like, they'll take one dose and they're going to be super responders, and they're going to have like put on massive amounts of muscle. And then other guys are taking twice as much, and they're not putting on near as much muscle as the guy who's taking half as much. That just has to do with how your body adapts to certain stimulus, certain substances, whatever it may be. So we're all different. So there is no standard protocol. It's going to be like, hey, this is the rate of improvement you can expect. Some people, to go from point A to point B, might take a year. Some, it might take 2 or 3 months.
I love what you said this way early on, but well, you sort of alluded to it whenever we were talking about the new guide for alpinism or whatever the actual name of the book is. In that book, those guys are laying training plans out over a year to a year and a half.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's a long game, and I think and you can speak to this even more than I could, but looking at that and saying the picture or the image that you've got painted in your head of this ideal you, whether that's ideal endurance athlete, ideal physique athlete, ideal whatever athlete it looks like. You may not even consider yourself an athlete, but whatever that looks like, that may be possible, but it may take a very years to accomplish the fruition of this goal. Like, so if you tease out a 5-year plan, let's say that maybe you want to improve your, let's say there's a 12 mile let's call it a 12 mile, let's call it a 30-day or 30-mile multi-day hike somewhere near you that you want to be able to accomplish in less and less and less and less time. That may
Yeah.
be possible, but it may take, maybe year one you shave off 20 minutes, year two you shave off 20 minutes, year three you shave off another 30 minutes, right? But
Yeah.
it's a process of continually, like, it's almost like a sculpture. You continue to hone it, continue to hone it, continue to hone it. It's a long term type of a thing.
Yeah.
So at what point in your experience can an athlete or a person say, okay, I've pretty much exhausted this block of training and I need to focus on something else for a period of time, let's say, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I guess so I would look at, you should always have transition periods or deloads through any program. And typically you're going to see those every three to 6 weeks. You're probably going to need a week to where you're going to drop volume and intensity. Depending on what the program is, you're going to manipulate one or the other. And endurance side, you're dropping volume, right? So you may do build, 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 build. And let's use running as an example and say you get up to maybe you're a 25-mile week or something like that. Then you're probably going to need a week to cut back down to like 5 to 10 miles just to like let everything kind of settle and reset. That would be a very basic idea of like, hey, deload and using periodization, right? Kind of breaking up your seasons, or your year into like seasons, right? So like, let's look at hunting for an example. Hunting season, September, October, November, right? So in January, you don't need to do hunt specific stuff. Like you don't need to do that. Like just, hey, run, row, ride the bike, hike. You don't have to train with your boots on. You don't need to carry your bow when you're out, walking around, right? You can just do general training January, February, March. Now, when you start getting to like June, July, August, like that's when it's like, okay, hey, let's start shifting our training, changing it a little bit, because basically like training is going to create very general, I guess the best word, general physical attributes are going to be developed, right? Your strength, your aerobic energy system, maybe your anaerobic energy system, maybe your muscular endurance, maybe core, grip strength, whatever it may be. Those are all going to happen through training. At a certain point, you don't want to just bench press, every week, 52 weeks in a row, right? You're going to need to change it up. Maybe you're going to go dumbbell flies. Maybe you're going to go cable crossovers. Maybe you're going to start doing incline or decline or pause. You're going to have to change the stimulus ever so often. And typically, and there's a couple of rules on when to do that. If you just naturally rotate them like we do in our gym, mostly for variety, because people come to our facility, like they want to get better, but they also want to have fun, right? And I think a lot of people out there, like if you're really, really just like performance only, it's like, cool, just run, just do the barbell lifts, just do this, right? And that's going to give you the best return on investment, essentially. But if you want to keep it to where like, hey, I kind of like my training sessions have a little bit of variety, because if they're always the same, I'm not going to do them. And if I change them up a little bit, it's kind of like, for example, you're a dietitian, you might prescribe, this is how many calories, you're going to need per day, and this is your macro breakdown, right? You can just come up with one menu item and basically tell them, hey, eat this much of it, then this much, then this much. But they're going to like, well, I'm not going to eat the same thing 3 times a day, 7 days a week. So you have a menu that has variety, right? So you can kind of change it up. Same thing is going to be pretty important for most people, I think, in regards to training the exercise, the structure, the modality, the anything, even with your tempo. Like right now, we're doing a lot of isometric holds. We're doing a lot of pauses in certain positions just to keep the variety up and keep the interest high.
Yeah, there is a another guy you may be aware of him. He was involved with physically training a lot of the special forces guy. I think he was based out of Delaware. Mike Prevost. We had him on podcast for a little while. Great guy. Anyway, he said the same thing. He was like, honestly, when you're dealing with SF guys, oftentimes they'll look at your programming. It's going to get them where they want to be, but they're thinking it's so simple that they're writing it off.
Yeah.
So he's like, I would just throw random stuff in just to keep them engaged, just random
Yeah.
hard things in just to keep them engaged with it.
Yeah. I mean, like sometimes we'll just do a session and just like our athletes will get accustomed. We just, athletes, people who train at the gym, they're not all competitive athletes. But like, we'll just kind of break them off sometimes just to kind of give them that mental, like it's just like, hey, this is 60 minutes unbroken, like go. And they're like, what, and the whole thing there is like, we're breaking some of the physiological rules with volume and a few other things, just to kind of like train the mind. And you kind of have to do that sometimes, right? I mean, you've packed out animals before. It's not always going to be, X number of miles through open terrain with a 100-pound pack, right? You may have deadfall. You may be going uphill. You might be crossing the rivers. And, like I've never had, no two pack outs are alike. So it's one of those things where sometimes you just got to do something really hard just to kind of like develop that grit, and also just remember that like, hey, I still have it. I still have that ability just to get in there, suffer, grit my teeth and just work.
I think one of the most effective things in doing stuff like that I've found for myself is it sort of has developed this, and I don't want to make myself sound like, oh man, I'm hardcore. I'm not. But one of the things that it's developed is this sense in my head of, I'll figure it out. Like, I don't know. I can't plan. I can't,
Yeah.
my brain automatically wants to go into preparation mode and to try to do everything I can to control everything. And one of the things by taking some of those things on, whether it was like, the death hike with the EXO guys or different pack outs or committing to going to hunt in terrible weather and snowstorms is I don't know. I'll figure it out. Once I get there, I'll figure it out and I'll be all right and I'll figure it out. And so just committing to not having the answers, but going anyway and committing to figuring out once I get there has been maybe one of the most enlightening things to me by doing stuff like that, right? Like you show up to a workout and somebody's got something prescribed and it looks really hard and you're like, this seems miserable.
Yeah.
I guess I'm about to figure out how it goes.
Yeah. I think a lot of guys, they try to do something like that all the time, especially military guys. And I mean, there's even some company that their whole thing is like the mind is everything. And it's like, I mean, it is good to have mental toughness, and it is good to be able to like, grit out, through very challenging things, bad weather, high volume, long duration, right? That's good, but you can't ignore science, like the body and your body, depending on what body it is, how many miles are on it and how developed it is going to have that same threshold we talked about earlier. And once you get there, it's like, hey man, you can keep going if you want, but it's not going to do you any good. It's probably going to hurt you more. It doesn't mean you're weak. It just means like you're being honest and be like, hey, like my body's at a point. Training is very different than testing, right? So your test may be your marathon or the death hike or packing out an animal. Training does not need to be a test, nor should it. You don't have Olympians out there running their marathon at race pace multiple times again and again and again through their training program, right? They race, they train, they have a big race, they rest, and they train again. So that's kind of, and the longer the event, the harder the event is. Like, I mean, you could do max reps pull-ups every week. That's not going to really hurt you, right? It's not, you're not doing that much damage. You're doing anywhere between 5 and 25 repetitions most likely. But going out and running 20 miles at race pace is not something that's sustainable, multiple times back to back. So you have to be smart.
Jake, can't thank you enough, man. So it's incredibly enlightening. I was going to say it's always enlightening, and that's largely because I follow your guys' programming, and every time you throw an email out, it's always great stuff. So, if people aren't subscribed there, I'd encourage them to go do that. But anything else you want to pass along? Where can they find Atomic Athlete or find you, or last minute tips, advice that you want to give?
I just, you can find us online. It's pretty easy these days. And then, yeah, just, don't fall into the Kool-Aid you see get spread around on social media. It's just, the simple, most effective things work really well.
It's good. Good closer. Appreciate you coming, man.
No problem. Great having me.
A big thanks to Jake for spending some time with me to talk about these things. So, in today's world, one of the biggest points of confusion for people is they feel like the more complex a program is, whether that's nutrition or training or finance or anything for that matter, then that means that it's got to automatically be better outcomes. That has to mean I'm going to be a better version of myself following this because it's more complex than another program. That is completely false in all spectrums of physical training as well as in the spectrum of nutrition. So the main 3 takeaways Jake outlined again were: number 1, simply try to make fitness a habit. Number 2, try to participate in that fitness or train 3 to 5 times per week. And then number 3, make sure that training program has a good mixture of both strength and conditioning. So both strength and cardiovascular fitness, trying to improve you overall as a person to get where you want. We obviously dived into a ton of other topics, and if you've got questions specific to those, you can reach out to Jake and the folks over at Atomic Athlete in the contact information below. We will continue our series on no off season next week as Mark and I start to look at what are the other 3 to 4 most often overlooked things that folks do not focus on during the off season that they should be. So hope you'll join us for that. That'll drop in 2 weeks. If you have any questions, you can send those to us at info@v2pnutrition.com. If you've got questions that you want to hear covered in one of our frequently asked questions that we will be doing quite a bit of this year, we've gotten tons of emails on different questions, so I'm excited to dive into those. You can send those to the email as well. But we appreciate you joining us and look forward to you joining us again next week. Have a great week, everybody.